back on the rails. It was all I was thinking about. And when I realized pretty early, okay, that happened. It's a really good team with massive potential, super age group, super characters, all that. I was talking with a few friends not long ago, and somebody asked me a question that honestly made me stop for a second. He said, Jürgen, you've coached incredible players, you've faced incredible players, but who are the footballers you've admired the most? I laughed, because that's a much harder question than people think. If you ask me who the greatest player is, everybody already has an opinion. Those conversations never end. Somebody says Messi, somebody says Cristiano, somebody brings up Maradona or Pelé. Football fans can argue about that forever. But admiration isn't really about arguments. It's personal. Sometimes you admire somebody because of what they do with the ball. Sometimes it's because of the way they carry themselves when nobody's watching. Sometimes it's because one afternoon on a football pitch changes the way you see the game forever. Football has introduced me to thousands of people over the years. Some became my players. Some became my opponents. Some became close friends. Others only crossed my path for 90 minutes, but somehow stayed in my mind much longer than that. The funny thing is, when somebody asks a question like this, you don't sit there looking through trophies or statistics. Faces simply appear in your head, almost immediately. Not because they scored the most goals, not because they won the most titles, because they left something with you. And when I gave that question a little more thought, these were the 5 players who came to my mind first. The first person I want to talk about is Pep Guardiola. Now, I know some people will hear that name and immediately think about all the matches we've coached against each other. That's fair. We've spent years standing on opposite touchlines, trying to solve the same football problems in completely different ways. But my admiration for Pep didn't begin there. It started long before either of us was standing in a technical area. I remember watching Barcelona and thinking about how calm everything looked whenever Pep had the ball. He wasn't the fastest player on the pitch. He wasn't trying to dribble past 5 defenders. He wasn't looking for the spectacular. He always seemed to know where the next pass should go before everyone else did. People usually remember football for the goals. I understand that. Goals are what end up in the highlights, but I've always believed there are players who make the goals possible long before the final pass is played. Pep was one of those players. What I admired was the way he seemed to understand the rhythm of a match. Some players speed the game up, some slow it down. Pep somehow knew exactly which one the team needed. That isn't something you can easily teach. It's a feeling, it's an understanding of football that goes deeper than tactics written on a board. Years later, when we started coaching against each other, I wasn't surprised at all by the football his teams played. In a strange way, it felt like an extension of the player I had watched years before. The same patience, the same intelligence, the same belief that the ball should always have a purpose. People often ask me what it's like competing against Pep. The truth is, it's exhausting. Not because you know you're going to lose, because every small mistake will be punished. You spend the whole week preparing. You think you found a solution. Then the match begins, and 20 minutes later you're already asking yourself a completely different question. That's what the very best football minds do. They force everyone around them to improve. I honestly believe I've become a better coach because I've had to compete with Pep so many times. Rivalries are supposed to make you uncomfortable. Ours certainly did. But they also make you grow if you're willing to learn. When I think about the players I've admired the most, I don't only think about moments on the pitch. I think about the people who changed the way I look at football. Pep Guardiola has done that for me more than once. And that's why his name came into my head almost immediately. The next person I want to talk about is Robert Lewandowski. People usually begin with the goals. I understand why. If you score as many as Robert has over the years, that's naturally the first thing everyone remembers. But honestly, that's not where my mind goes first. I think about the training ground. I think about those mornings when most people would have been satisfied with a good session and Robert still wanted one more repetition, one more finish, one more sprint, one more chance to get a little bit better. That's something people don't always see. Fans watch 90 minutes on a Saturday. Coaches see everything that happens on a Tuesday morning when nobody is paying attention. That's where you really learn who a player is. Robert was never interested in doing just enough. There were days when training had already finished and he'd still be working. Maybe it was his movement inside the penalty area, maybe it was his finishing, maybe it was something so small that most people would never notice. To him, those small details mattered. And over time, those details became the difference between a very good striker and one of the best in the world. One thing I always appreciated about Robert was that success never seemed to make him comfortable. Some players score 20 goals and begin believing they figured football out. Robert would score 20 goals and immediately start thinking about the next 20. That kind of mentality is rare. You can't coach it. You can encourage it, but it has to come from inside the player. Of course, I remember the goals. I remember the big nights in Dortmund. I remember stadiums celebrating and defenders walking away wondering what they could have done differently. Everybody remembers those moments. What I remember is the work that came before them, the hours that nobody filmed, the conversations after training, the constant search for improvement. That's the Robert Lewandowski. I was fortunate enough to know. Watching him develop over those years was one of the most rewarding experiences I've had as a coach. Not because I created him. Coaches don't create great players. They simply help them discover what they're already capable of becoming. Robert did the hard part himself. He earned everything that came his way. When I look back now, I don't just see one of the greatest strikers of his generation. I see someone who reminded me every single day that talent opens the door, but discipline is what keeps you inside. That's why Robert Lewandowski will always be one of the players I've admired the most. The next person I want to talk about is Sir Alex Ferguson. Now, before anybody says it, I know we never worked together. We never shared the dressing room. We spent most of our careers looking at football from different places. But sometimes you don't have to know somebody personally to admire what they've built. I remember the first time I walked into Old Trafford as a visiting manager. You could feel it. Some stadiums are loud, some stadiums are beautiful. Old Trafford had something different. It felt like every corner of that place had a story to tell. And almost every one of those stories somehow led back to Sir Alex. People usually remember the trophies. They remember the Premier League titles. They remember the Champions League nights. I understand that. But honestly, that's not what impressed me the most. What impressed me was the consistency. Football changes so quickly. Players change, owners change. Expectations become bigger every year. Most managers are lucky if they get a few seasons to build something. Sir Alex built something that lasted for decades. That's incredibly difficult. One thing I've always believed is that managing a football team isn't only about tactics. Anybody can spend hours drawing arrows on a board. The real challenge is convincing 25 different personalities to believe in the same idea, to keep believing after a defeat, to stay humble after a victory, to accept that the team will always come before the individual. That's where Sir Alex was extraordinary. Year after year, Manchester United changed players. The football changed. Generations came and went. But the mentality never seemed to disappear. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because somebody creates a culture that survives even when individual players leave. As a manager, I've always admired that. Of course, we competed against Manchester United, and when you're competing, you don't spend much time thinking about admiration. You're too busy trying to win. But Football has a funny way of changing your perspective once the final whistle is gone. You begin appreciating things you were too busy to notice at the time. The older I've become, the more respect I've had for what Sir Alex achieved. Not because of one season, not because of one trophy, because doing something great once is difficult. Doing it again and again for more than 20 years is something very few people will ever accomplish. When I think about the people who shaped modern football, Sir Alex Ferguson is always one of the first names that comes into my mind. And that's why he'll always have my admiration. The next person I want to talk about is Cristiano Ronaldo. I think a lot of people misunderstand what makes Cristiano so special. The first thing they see is the goals. Then they see the trophies. Then they see the celebrations. That's understandable because those are the moments everybody remembers. But that's never been the first thing I admired about him. What always impressed me was the commitment. People like to say that great players are born with extraordinary talent. Of course they are. Nobody reaches Cristiano's level without unbelievable ability. But talent alone doesn't explain a career that lasts as long as his has. There has to be something more. Every time one of my teams prepared to play against Cristiano, we knew exactly what was coming. He would run, he would compete for every ball, he would attack every cross as if it were the most important moment of the match. And somehow, even after everything he had already achieved, he still played with the hunger of somebody trying to prove himself for the very first time. That's difficult to explain. Most people become comfortable after success. Cristiano never looked comfortable. He always looked like he wanted one more goal, one more victory, one more challenge. As a coach, you notice things supporters don't always see. You notice how seriously a player treats every moment. You notice the standards they set for themselves. You notice how much attention they give to the smallest details. Cristiano has always been one of those players. That's why preparing to face him was never easy. You could defend well for most of the game. You could limit the space. You could follow the plan almost perfectly. Then, for 1 second, you lose concentration. One cross, one header, one finish, and suddenly everything changes. That's what the greatest players do. They don't need 10 opportunities. Sometimes they only need one. I've always respected footballers who refuse to let success make them relax. Cristiano has spent almost his entire career chasing another level, even when most people thought there wasn't another level left to reach. That mentality deserves admiration. The funny thing is, rivalries often stop you from appreciating people in the moment. You're too focused on winning, too focused on solving problems. It's only later, when you look back over the years, that you realize how fortunate you were to compete against players like Cristiano Ronaldo. Not because they made your job easier, quite the opposite. They forced you to become better. And when I think about the players I've admired the most, Cristiano Ronaldo is one of the first names that will always come to mind. The last player I want to talk about is Lionel Messi. I don't think I've ever met a coach who enjoyed preparing to play against Messi. Honestly, I don't think that's possible. You can spend an entire week watching videos. You can study every movement. You can build a plan that looks perfect on a tactics board. Then the game starts. Messi touches the ball a few times, and suddenly your plan doesn't seem nearly as clever as it did 2 days earlier. That's football sometimes. People usually begin with the goals, or the dribbling, or the assists. I understand all of that because we've seen things from Messi that very few footballers have ever been capable of doing. But what always amazed me was how effortless everything looked. The game never seemed rushed around him. Everyone else looked like they were playing at one speed. Messi looked like he was playing at another. He never appeared to force anything. He simply waited. He saw spaces before other players noticed they were there. He found passes that most people didn't even imagine. And when everybody expected him to pass, he would score himself. That's what made him so difficult to stop. It wasn't only his ability. It was his understanding of the game. I remember standing on the touchline more than once watching him do something that made absolutely no sense from a coaching perspective. You tell your players to close every angle. They do exactly that. And somehow he still finds another one. There aren't many players who make experienced coaches look at each other and simply smile. Messi did that. Not because we enjoyed it, because sometimes you have to accept that you're watching something you'll probably never see again. One thing I've always respected is that Messi never seemed interested in making football look complicated. The greatest players often make the hardest things appear completely natural. That's an incredible gift. Millions of young players have tried to copy him. Very few have come close. Not because they didn't work hard, because some things simply can't be taught. The funny thing is, people often ask me if it was frustrating coaching against him. Of course it was. Nobody enjoys seeing their team suffer. But football is bigger than winning one match. Sometimes you're fortunate enough to witness greatness from the other side. Years later, that's what stays with you. You don't remember every tactical adjustment. You don't remember every team meeting. You remember moments. You remember the feeling inside the stadium when Messi received the ball and 40,000 people leaned forward at exactly the same time. Everybody knew something might happen. Most of the time it did. Looking back now, I realize football has given me the chance to meet extraordinary people and compete against extraordinary players. Each person on this list taught me something different. Robert reminded me that improvement never stops. Cristiano showed me what relentless ambition looks like. Pep changed the way I think about football. Sir Alex showed the entire world what lasting excellence looks like. But if someone asked me which player left me in complete disbelief more often than anyone else, my answer would always be the same. Lionel Messi. That's why when I sat and thought about the football players I've admired the most, his name was the very first one that came into my mind. Looking back now, I think I've been very fortunate. Football gave me wonderful memories. It gave me incredible stadiums. It gave me unforgettable matches. But more than anything else, it gave me people. That's what stays with you when the noise disappears. The trophies eventually find a place on a shelf. The medals end up in a drawer somewhere. The newspaper headlines fade away, but the people never really leave you. When I think about Robert Lewandowski, I think about discipline. When I think about Pep Guardiola, I think about understanding the game in a way very few people ever will. When I think about Sir Alex Ferguson, I think about standards that never change, no matter how many years passed. When I think about Cristiano Ronaldo, I think about ambition that never seemed satisfied. And when I think about Lionel Messi, I think about the pure joy of watching somebody do things that shouldn't have been possible on a football pitch. The funny thing is, none of these players made me love football because they won trophies. They made me love football because they reminded me how many different ways greatness can exist. Some inspire you with intelligence. Some inspire you with hard work. Some inspire you with leadership. Some inspire you simply because they make you smile every time they touch the ball. I've always believed football is at its best when it makes you feel something. These 5 players did that for me. Every single one of them. If I had the chance to sit down with all 5 of them in the same room, I honestly don't think we'd spend much time talking about medals or statistics. We'd probably talk about dressing rooms, training sessions, the matches that almost nobody remembers. The little moments that somehow became the biggest memories. Because that's what football really is. It's not only 90 minutes. It's a lifetime of people crossing paths, learning from one another, competing with one another, and leaving something behind. I'm grateful that my journey allowed me to meet players like these, coach against some of them, work alongside others, and simply admire them from wherever I happen to be standing. And if someone asked me that same question again tomorrow, I have a feeling my answer would probably be exactly the same. These are the 5 football players I have admired the most. And I don't think I'll ever stop admiring them.